Hello again, Quarantographers. Hope you guys are out there staying safe and sane and healthy and all that stuff. I had a request for a video on architecture. Now, architecture is something I very much enjoy. I've done a fair amount of shooting in that direction. It's not necessarily a specialty of mine, but I can definitely speak to a few useful tips and tricks that might help you get more out of an architecture walk. Architecture walks are a really great thing to do right now, provided you put on a mask and keep your distance. Lets you get outside, get some fresh air, get to know your neighborhood better, or even take a bike ride to another neighborhood and get to know that one better. It's also very equipment light for the most part. You don't need a bunch of lighting or anything. You just have to kind of work with what you're given. So first thing I want to talk about in this case is light. As I've spoken to before, my preferred mode of shooting is in direct sunlight. I very much like the shadows cast by hard sunlight. I think colors pop more, and frankly I like working with the wider dynamic range and playing with that as part of my processing style. And if you have a modern camera these days, you should be able to fit all of the dynamic range of an outdoor sunny scene in one frame. It used to be, if you wanted that kind of dynamic range from a digital file, that you'd have to set up on a tripod and focus bracket and merge them into a 16-bit TIFF and tone map manually. It was a whole thing. Lately, with more modern sensors and modern RAW processors, you can really pull a lot out of just a base image. And if you are careful about where you expose, you actually don't even need to do that much in that direction either. The images I'm playing with here have more or less been loaded directly into Lightroom, so they're not going to have the expressive color I'd like in a finished product, but that's not what we're here to learn today. So one of the big things I like to talk about when it comes to architecture is keystoning. Basically, the idea is, unless your camera is pointed directly flat, you're gonna get that kind of converging lines effect in buildings should you look up, the kind that classically is described as making it look like the building is falling backwards. And when I first learned about this trick, I was very contrarian about it. I thought like, oh, well, that's just natural. That's how the eye sees it. So why should I correct for it? Where the actual truth of it is a little bit more complex. I mean, our brains are actually editing out that sort of convergence of lines all the time. When you look up, you don't experience the image as converging in that way. You experience that the lines are straight because your brain is correcting for it. It's only when you really, turn off that part of your brain and just try and see the lines converging that you actually can. So in many ways, correcting for this particular distortion is more correct. So there are a couple of ways to do this. I'm gonna start with the easiest way, in my opinion. Modern RAW converters have something called the keystone correction, or in Lightroom they call it transform. So here's the image straight at a camera. It's not too bad. I deliberately took this from an angle that it wouldn't be terrible to start. But as you can see, the lines are converging very slightly. It does look a little bit like it's leaning back, and it's very easy to correct. In Lightroom, all you have to do is click these guided uprights, find two vertical lines, even gives you this nice little pop up here. And boom, it corrects the image. As you can see, it's giving you a little bit of a V shape there at the edges, so you have to crop in to make it work. But your lines are straight and your image looks corrected. So provided you give yourself enough room around the critical edges of your image, this is a great way to do it. However, sometimes, for one reason or the other, you would rather get it right in camera. Sometimes I'll shoot for the times and they do not allow this particular correction. So what you have to do is A, own a tilt shift lens, which I'm not really going to get into, but basically it allows for lens movements that are otherwise impossible on a 35mm camera. It's inspired by the swing and tilt functions of a 4x5 large format film camera, but you can kind of fake it if you just use a wide enough lens. Here I've set my lens to 16mm and shot way wider than is required. As you can see around here, I actually gave myself a ton of space. And the reason for that is, in order to get the eventual composition that I wanted, I knew in my head that this was the composition I wanted. I gave myself a lot of room around places that I needed to make sure were in the image, and then I turned my camera straight down so it's facing the horizon flat on, knowing later on I was going to crop in. And that's the effect it gets. It actually gives more or less the same effect as keystoning in post. So that's just a nice little thing to keep in mind. If you were using a tilt-shift lens, what would effectively be happening is you would zoom in more on this area, you would set it to be straight on, and then you would shift the lens upwards so that you would get the part of the image you were after. It's kind of complicated. Read it once sometime. They're a lot of fun. Something to keep in mind as you get to more extreme perspective corrections is that you can kind of get images that look a little strange. I'll show you the original here. This is out of camera, and you know the lean back is pretty extreme here. I got pretty close, I went with a wide angle lens, and I corrected it here. And it's actually a little frustrating. It doesn't look particularly bad in this shot, I don't think, but you can see there's some stretching happening up here at the top of the statues. In some buildings you would notice that this looks a little bit dog-eared. If I went on an angle, it would start looking like a crazy point. It just starts to look a little odd to the eye. And it happens whether you do it in camera. This is the in-camera version. I had a polarizer on, that's why the background looks different. But once again, whether you do it in camera or in post, the only difference is basically how many pixels you have to work with. You're doing a pretty extreme crop if you do it in camera, and you're losing a little bit fewer to do it in post. But yeah, do keep an eye out on this. You might actually want to back off a little bit on your transform. Make it a little less extreme. Something like that. So now there's a little bit of lean. Not a crazy amount, but the statue looks a lot more normal, for example. Once again, out of camera, corrected. The next big tip I have for you guys is a circular polarizer. It is a lens filter that is extremely helpful for several reasons in architecture. The first being the sky. So, for those of you who don't know, a polarizer blocks a certain kind of light that is often very prevalent in the side of the sky that is away from the sun. It doesn't work so well when you're pointing towards the sun, especially when the sun is lower in the sky. I did shoot this at noon, so it's not as extreme. You can get this kind of sky darkening effect that helps kind of minimize the dynamic range in your shot. So here it is with the polarizer on, and here it is, well, here it is off, but you can also turn the polarizer the kind of incorrect direction and have the same effect. You have to kind of turn the polarizer, and depending on the angle of the light that is polarizing, it'll have a slightly different effect. And sometimes you actually don't want to go full polarized. Sometimes the effect can be especially dramatic, especially at like later times of day, and you only want to turn it like 45 degrees instead of 90. But just to give you an example of something I can do, here's polarization, here's non-polarization. And it has some other interesting effects too, namely in reflections. If you're looking at something like, say, these statues, you might have spotted this earlier. Here's a picture of the statues with the polarizer turned to block reflections, and here's it without. It's a pretty dramatic difference. Here's another one of those. Here's with reflections, and here's without. So it can really help tamp down on some of those more distracting reflections. It even works with clear glass. It doesn't work straight on so much. If you're facing straight onto the glass, you'll find that it might block a couple things, but unfortunately it won't necessarily stop you from seeing yourself in the reflection, which would be the most useful thing. Unfortunately, it really only kind of works at like a 30-degree angle, a glancing angle off of the glass. Here is without the polarizer, and here is with it. And you'll also note that with certain kinds of glass, certain more modern kinds of glass, you get this kind of purplish tinge. I haven't read too much into it, but I imagine it's because there's some sort of polarizing technology in that glass as well, and the two polarizers are kind of conversing. So that's a really useful thing. Finally, another great thing polarizers can do for your image is affect the color of plants, especially. Green ones, especially. Here's an image of this suggestive looking pillar enshrouded by green plants. I have the polarizer on here, and here's it off. That's a pretty dramatic difference. All the leaves are kind of dimming their reflections a little bit when you turn the polarizer on. And it really makes for a more verdant green coloring in the image, which can be very helpful. It even kind of tones down the reflection off the concrete. You can see it's a little brighter here than it is here. And then my third tip is don't just focus on these wide shots. If you're doing a story about the architecture of an area, you should get them. They're kind of an important shot. That's not where the really interesting stuff comes out. It's almost as if the wider your shot is, the closer there is like a correct answer that you just kind of have to get the best angle. And there's not really as much argument there and there's not as much creativity there. So what I'd recommend is shoot this like a story. Get a wide angle shot, but also hop in there and get some really nice close-ups, stuff that kind of expresses what you think of as interesting in this shot. And, you know, for me, I always like to look for areas where the light is doing something interesting, but it's the details that really make an architectural shoot stand out. So yeah, that is my quick discussion on architecture photography. If you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. We have a great community on Patreon where people chime in all the time with their questions and discussions, and I've found it to be a really nice resource in these times. So until next time, stay safe, stay sane, stay shooting. Thanks.